Picture the scene. A girl named Elise, barely in her teens, stands at the edge of a dimly lit chamber in the year 1350. Her father has just bartered her future for a sack of grain and a promise of safety. Across the room, her new husband waits, grey-haired, hardened by years in the fields, a man closer to her father's age than her own. The floor beneath her bare feet is strewn with straw, rough and damp, scratching her skin as she shifts nervously. A single tallow candle throws long shadows against the stone walls, its smoke mingling with the sour stench of sweat and stale ale. Outside, drunken voices jeer and bang on wooden cups, demanding to hear the proof of the marriage sealed. Her pulse races as she clutches the coarse linen gown handed down through generations, a relic of women before her whose fates were bound to the same ritual. When his hand reaches toward her, trembling questions fill her mind. Could her mother's hushed warnings about a wife's duties ever have prepared her for this moment of fear and resignation?
This is not the tale of passion or romance. This is the harsh reality of medieval intimacy, a world ruled by superstition, the iron grip of the church, and customs so alien and oppressive that they shatter any modern idea of love. Before we peel back these hidden pages of history, if you're drawn to uncovering the secrets that were never taught in school, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories like these. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I find it extraordinary that across centuries and continents, we're connected by a shared curiosity for the darker truths of the past. The medieval bedchamber was not a sanctuary but a battlefield, where desire collided with doctrine, where flesh was bound by law, and where even the most private acts of human life were twisted by fear, politics, and control. These weren't matters of preference. They were questions of the soul, family reputation, and sometimes survival itself. Let me draw you back into Elise's world, where a wife was legally her husband's property, where menstrual blood was feared as poison that could rot crops, and where the wrong position in bed might condemn you to eternal fire. In medieval Europe, the marriage bed was never the couples alone. The community, the priest, and centuries of superstition all had a stake in it. When Elise was married off to Bernard in the fall of 1350, their union wasn't marked by celebration or romance. It was a contract, sealed through her body, confirmed by neighbors who demanded proof that the act had taken place. The ritual began with what was called the bedding, a custom where guests would shove the newlyweds into their chamber, strip away their clothes while shouting crude songs, and then linger outside the door to ensure they heard what they considered the necessary cries. Only then would the union be considered valid, but the rules of medieval intimacy grew even stranger. The church taught that even married couples could sin in their own beds. Early church writers insisted that a man who showed too much passion toward his wife was guilty of corruption. Pleasure was not a blessing. It was dangerous to the soul. These weren't abstract ideas. They shaped how people lived. By the mid-13th century, theologians like Thomas Aquinas laid down exact instructions. Sex was only permitted on certain days, only in certain seasons, and only in one natural position. The man above, the woman beneath, face to face. Anything else was branded unnatural and sinful. Oral contact was absolutely forbidden. Intercourse during menstruation, pregnancy, or breastfeeding was condemned. Calculations by clerics suggested that if all restrictions were observed, a couple could only share a bed perhaps 50 days in an entire year. Young brides didn't learn these rules from books but from their mothers, who in turn had been lectured by their confessors. In this way, generation after generation, the church's doctrine reached straight into the most private corners of the home. The shadow of eternal punishment lingered over every touch. So when Bernard reached for Elise on a fast day in Lent, she was trapped between two terrors: surrender and risk her soul, or resist and endure his anger in a culture where a husband's violence was not only tolerated, but often seen as his right. Medieval ideas about women's sexuality rested on flawed theories that would echo for centuries. Influenced by Greek and Roman writers, medical texts of the time described women not as equals, but as imperfect versions of men. Doctors argued that the female body was simply the male body turned inside out, the womb imagined as an inverted phallus, the ovaries explained away as hidden testicles. Far from fringe belief, this was science, taught in Europe's universities and copied in medical manuals. Such misconceptions shaped how female desire was understood. In the 11th century, the physician Constantine the African insisted that conception required women to experience extended arousal and multiple climaxes. From this, a twisted logic emerged. Rape, they argued, could not lead to pregnancy because the necessary pleasure was absent. And if a pregnancy did follow an assault, courts often ruled it as proof that the woman had secretly consented, a devastating verdict that blamed the victim rather than the crime. Mothers warned daughters of even stranger fears, like the so-called wandering womb. Physicians claimed the uterus could drift through the body, strangling the heart or pressing against the lungs, leaving women hysterical or even dead. Treatments were as bizarre as the diagnosis. Perfumed smoke blown into the vagina to guide the womb back to its rightful place, or foul odors forced under the nose to drive it downward.
This was the landscape of medieval intimacy, a world where myth, medicine, and morality combined to create rules that were both cruel and absurd. The Middle Ages carried forward a tangled legacy of fertility superstitions, remnants of ancient pagan rites that the Church never fully stamped out. In villages, midwives and healers, later demonized as witches, guarded secret knowledge of plants, charms, and rituals meant to spark conception, block it, or sway fate toward producing sons. In the woods beyond Elise's hamlet, women would slip away under moonlight to gather herbs. Tansy and pennyroyal were brewed into bitter teas said to prevent pregnancy, though the fine line between a contraceptive dose and a deadly one was terrifyingly thin. Mandrake roots, with their uncanny human shapes, were treasured as fertility charms. So prized were they that trick versions, carved from ordinary roots, flooded market stalls across Europe. Though priests railed against these practices as sorcery, even the most devout could not abandon them entirely. Faith and folklore intertwined in daily life. A woman might whisper prayers to St. Margaret for a safe delivery, while burying part of her afterbirth beneath the doorway for future luck. She could wear a crucifix openly to Mass, yet conceal a polished amber stone between her breasts to guard against miscarriage. Medieval birth control was a volatile mix of superstition and desperation. Women were told to leap backwards 7 times after intercourse, or to sip wine laced with ground insects. More perilous still were potions spiked with mercury or lead, brews that killed as often as they prevented conception.
The price of failure was immense. Without reliable methods, every pregnancy carried the shadow of death. Maternal mortality was staggering. 1/3 of women might not survive delivery. For the unmarried, the stakes were even harsher: disgrace, banishment, or worse. And when options ran out, infanticide, though condemned by the Church, remained a grim and whispered reality. Marriage itself was less a union of love than a calculated bargain, with women's bodies reduced to territory in a relentless struggle for survival, status, and heirs. When Elise's father bargained her future to Bernard, her untouched body was treated as the true currency of the deal, worth more than coin, fields, or livestock. The virginity itself became a kind of family treasure, proof not only of the girl's chastity, but of her kin's honor. The first night of marriage was not a private rite of passage, it was a public test. The stained sheets were expected to be shown to relatives and neighbors as evidence that purity had been spent and the contract sealed. If no blood appeared, the consequences could be brutal. A bride might be sent back in disgrace, accused of deceit, or in the worst cases, condemned to death. The burden on young women was crushing. Some resorted to pricking their fingers or using animal blood to mimic the expected evidence. All of this rested on false assumptions. Medieval physicians believed the hymen was an unbroken barrier sealing the body, rather than a thin, varied tissue. Its absence was taken as undeniable proof of prior intimacy, ignoring that it could be torn by riding a horse, carrying heavy loads, or through natural differences in anatomy. The Church's strict laws on consummation added another layer of strangeness. No union was considered valid until the act itself was completed, meaning even whispers from the bridal chamber could become grounds for legal battles. Ecclesiastical courts sometimes questioned both spouses in detail, examined the bride's body for signs, or even asked neighbors what noises they heard in the night. And when it came to sexual practice, doctrine ruled with iron certainty. The so-called missionary position was not just preferred, but deemed the only godly way. Man above, woman beneath, face to face. A wife on top was condemned as defying the natural order of male authority. Anything from behind was denounced as animalistic, blurring the line between human and beast. And yet, the writings of the Middle Ages reveal a far more complicated truth. In France, bawdy fabliaux, comic tales passed from minstrel to crowd in taverns and marketplaces, painted pictures of encounters that would have horrified any priest. These verses show us that, despite the threat of damnation, men and women still explored desire in ways that defied the Church's rigid commands. By the late 12th century, poets like Andreas Capellanus were already recording elaborate codes of courtly love. His guides detailed flirtations, embraces, and even instructions on physical intimacy that stood in sharp contrast to clerical prohibitions. Among nobles, at least, there seems to have been a recognition of pleasure that went well beyond the single, acceptable position preached from the pulpit. But knowledge of these practices was perilous. To be caught risked excommunication, exile, or worse. For medieval people, the danger wasn't only social or spiritual, it was supernatural. They believed the night itself teemed with predators. The figures of the succubus and incubus weren't fairy tales, they were treated as theological facts. The succubus, imagined as a female spirit, was said to visit men in their sleep, drawing their strength through lustful encounters. Erotic dreams, nocturnal emissions, even a stray thought of desire could all be blamed on her touch. The incubus, her male counterpart, was said to be stronger still, capable of holding women down and forcing itself upon them as they slept. Theologians even devised elaborate explanations for how these beings worked. A demon, they claimed, could appear first as a woman to harvest a man's seed, then assume male form to plant it inside another victim, producing offspring marked as cursed or unnatural. The consequences of such beliefs were devastating. A woman who admitted to disturbing dreams or waking with sensations she could not explain might be branded not a victim but a witch. What we recognize today as sleep paralysis, the terrifying inability to move while waking with crushing weight on the chest, was interpreted then as proof of demonic violation. In a world already ruled by fear, the boundaries between lust, sin, and sorcery blurred until even the most private struggles of the body could be judged as a pact with the devil. The Church promoted rituals of cleansing and exorcism to purify the afflicted, but in many cases those suspected of harboring demonic influence were condemned as witches and burned alive. Nowhere was superstition stronger than in attitudes toward menstruation. For centuries, monthly bleeding was framed not as a natural process, but as something dangerous and corrupting. Medieval scholars, still clinging to ancient authorities like Pliny the Elder, repeated claims that menstrual blood could blight crops, spoil wine, or strip metals of their edge. Some even argued it could drive animals mad, or sap a man of his strength. Women during their cycles were treated as hazardous, barred from entering churches, cooking meals, or handling holy objects. In some rural communities, they were forced to sleep apart in small huts until the bleeding ended. Clerics taught that menstruation was punishment for Eve's sin, branding every period as a reminder of female guilt. Misconceptions fed bizarre and often cruel treatments. Physicians warned that if blood did not leave the body fully, it would rot inside and poison the woman. To balance her humors, they prescribed bloodletting, vomiting, or harsh purges. Some even claimed that intercourse could cure menstrual troubles, insisting that a man's seed would cancel the blood's supposed toxicity. Yet women created their own hidden knowledge, passed from mother to daughter in whispers. They fashioned crude protections from moss, scraps of cloth, or sheep hide. They followed the moon's cycles to anticipate their own, and relied on herbs to soothe cramps or steady irregular flow. This quiet expertise existed in the shadows, kept secret from male doctors and priests who might denounce it as sorcery. Medieval medicine also spun intricate theories about compatibility in bed. Astrological signs, body types, and the balance of humors hot and cold, wet and dry, were believed to dictate fertility and satisfaction. A hot husband, it was thought, might fail with a cold wife, their mismatched elements dooming them to frustration and barren unions. Among the wealthier classes of medieval Europe, marriage arrangements often resembled veterinary inspections more than romantic unions. Physicians were summoned to scrutinize the bride's body, reading her shape like a coded text of destiny. Wide hips were praised as a sign of childbearing potential, while narrow ones were dismissed as a mark of infertility. The groom was not spared from this cold appraisal. His manhood was measured and judged for whether it would fit the chosen bride, as if they were livestock to be paired. The church added its own spiritual layer to these assessments. Compatibility was not just physical but also theological. Couples too closely bound by blood, or even by spiritual kinship such as shared godparents, were said to risk curses of impotence or malformed offspring. The tangled web of consanguinity laws meant many marriages collapsed years later when some forgotten ancestral tie came to light. Sexual identity in the medieval world was not a private matter. It was a public currency tied to status and survival. For men, virility was inseparable from honor and political power. A knight unable to perform in bed was mocked as unfit to lead in battle. Entire communities whispered coded insults and euphemisms for impotence, creating a language of humiliation that cut deeper than any sword.
For women, the stakes were even harsher. A single rumor could stain her reputation forever. To be seen speaking with an unrelated man was enough to be branded unchaste, threatening her family's honor and marriage prospects. In these tightly knit towns, where gossip traveled faster than the church bells, every step and word was watched. Even the legal system mirrored these warped views. Rape was not recognized as violence against a woman's body and will, but as a violation of property, the property of her father, husband, or lord. A woman's suffering was secondary. What mattered was the damage to a man's honor and ownership. Punishments for sexual crimes in the medieval world were anything but equal. The law bent sharply in favor of status and power. If a nobleman forced himself on a peasant woman, he might walk away after paying a token fee or making a small offering to the local lord. But if a peasant laid hands on a noblewoman, his fate was sealed: torture, mutilation, and often a gruesome execution. Justice was less about protecting women and more about defending property lines of class and honor. Adultery carried an even darker weight, but only for wives. A woman who strayed from her husband risked her very life. The law granted men the chilling right to kill both wife and lover if caught together, without fear of punishment. Husbands, on the other hand, could sleep with prostitutes, unmarried women, or their servants with near total impunity. Male infidelity was excused as natural. Female desire was treated as criminal treachery.
And yet, alongside this brutal reality, a strange cultural phenomenon blossomed. Among the aristocracy, poets and troubadours spun the ideal of courtly love, a vision where longing itself became a form of holiness. In this romantic mythology, genuine love could never be found within marriage. Instead, a knight's devotion to a lady outside his union was celebrated as noble suffering, a yearning that purified the soul through restraint and unattainable passion. It was literature, not life, but it reshaped how the medieval mind separated duty from desire. Down in the villages, love was far less ethereal. Courtship was often reduced to barter and bargaining. A father might marry his daughter to the miller because the price of flour was more valuable than her affections for the blacksmith's boy. Engagement customs reflected this tension. In some regions, betrothed couples were permitted to share a bed while fully clothed, separated by a plank known as a bundling board. Families listened, observed, and judged whether sparks of compatibility existed, testing physical connection without the risk of scandal. Beneath all this, older pagan traditions of sexual magic lingered like whispers from the past. Fertility rites outlawed by priests lived on, disguised in festivals or cloaked as folk remedies. Nowhere was this clearer than on May Day, when young villagers poured into the forests under the excuse of gathering flowers. They returned with branches for decoration, but everyone understood the night carried another purpose: a celebration of vitality, fertility,
and the secret freedoms that church bells could not silence.
Punishments for sexual transgressions in the Middle Ages were a mirror of hierarchy, not morality. The same crime could lead to vastly different outcomes depending on who committed it and against whom. If a lord violated a peasant girl, he might settle the matter with a coin purse or a token offering at the manor. But if a farmhand dared touch a noblewoman, the price was often his body, broken under torture, mutilated, or executed publicly as an example. The law's concern was not protecting women, but safeguarding male authority, property, and social order. Adultery revealed the cruelty of this imbalance even more starkly. For a wife, straying outside her marriage bed meant risking death. A husband who caught his spouse in the act could kill her and her lover on the spot, with the law standing firmly behind him. Men, however, faced no such restrictions. A husband could seek pleasure with unmarried women, tavern prostitutes, or household servants without repercussion. Male desire was considered natural, while female desire was condemned as betrayal. And yet, in noble courts, another narrative unfolded. Troubadours and poets crafted the ideal of courtly love, an almost mystical devotion where unfulfilled passion was praised as the highest form of purity. In this imagined world, true love existed only outside the bounds of marriage. A knight's loyalty to a lady who could never be his was celebrated as a kind of spiritual discipline, pain elevated into virtue. It was fantasy, but it rewired how medieval culture drew the line between obligation and desire.
Among peasants, marriage was far more practical. Love rarely decided unions. Dowries, land, and survival did. A young woman might prefer the blacksmith's son, but if the miller promised better terms to her father, her future was sealed. Customs reflected this tension. In some villages, engaged couples were allowed to lie together, fully clothed, separated by a wooden divider called a bundling board. Families would eavesdrop, hoping to gauge compatibility without risking scandal or pregnancy. Despite the church's grip, remnants of older fertility magic persisted in the shadows. Rituals condemned from the pulpit were practiced quietly in fields and forests. Nowhere was this more visible than on May Day. Villagers officially gathered flowers and branches to decorate their homes, but everyone knew the festival's hidden meaning. Young men and women slipped into the woods under the moonlight, celebrating renewal, fertility, and pleasures forbidden by the church. It was a fleeting night when ancient instincts overcame religious fear, a brief rebellion against the silence of the cloister bell. In the medieval imagination, the stars themselves played a role in the bedroom. The alignment of the heavens at the moment of conception was believed to shape not only the baby's gender, but also their destiny, temperament, and even future success. Sex was never just about the body. It was entangled with cosmic forces, divine judgment, and human surveillance. As the church tightened its grip, entire systems of control emerged. Networks of informants whispered confessions into priests' ears, turning the sacrament into a tool of surveillance. Parishioners were grilled, not just about sins of greed or pride, but about how often they lay with their spouses, in what position, and whether they felt pleasure. With the rise of the Inquisition in the 13th century, this obsession with regulation grew darker. Heresy trials often forced the accused to reveal the most intimate details of their sex lives under torture. Manuals for inquisitors included shockingly explicit questions, cataloguing every possible act as evidence of spiritual corruption. Punishments were designed to terrify as much as to penalize. An adulterous wife might be thrown into a coffin-sized cage, left to wither away on stale bread and water while the town watched her slow decline. A man accused of rape could face public castration before being hanged in the square. These brutal spectacles served as warnings to all. Step outside the sanctioned rules, and your body would pay the price. Yet beneath this cruelty, a hidden literature thrived. Learned physicians compiled detailed treatises on sexual techniques, positions, and fertility tricks, knowledge reserved for wealthy patrons who could afford manuscripts. Ordinary people, by contrast, relied on hushed songs, crude jokes, and painful trial and error to learn about intimacy. The church's own texts revealed an obsession with sex even in their condemnation. Penitential handbooks listed hundreds of forbidden acts, each with precise punishments, betraying a fixation that rivaled the sins they claimed to fight. Among the nobility, more polished manuals existed, offering pragmatic guidance on how to handle a wedding night, when to abstain during pregnancy, or how to maintain desire within arranged marriages. These guides revealed that behind closed doors, medieval elites were far less restrained than church rhetoric suggested. Efforts to control desire sometimes took grotesque symbolic form. The chastity belt, whether common or rare, represented the extreme fear of female autonomy, an iron barrier standing between women and their own bodies. Meanwhile, prostitution lived in a legal grey zone. The church thundered against it from the pulpit, but secular rulers quietly regulated brothels, taxing sex work and confining women to designated districts. Prostitutes were marked by distinctive clothing, forced to live apart, and subjected to humiliating inspections. It was a world where sexuality was both condemned and commodified, feared and exploited, hidden and yet everywhere.
The Middle Ages gave rise to some of the strangest sexual traditions ever whispered about in Europe. One of the most infamous was the so-called rite of the first night, where it was rumored that feudal lords could claim a peasant bride before her husband ever touched her. Whether this was fact or exaggerated myth, the idea alone reflected just how powerless and exposed peasant women were in matters of the body. Sex was thought to hold cosmic weight, shaping not only families, but the very world around them. Monarchs and nobles frequently turned to astrologers to determine the most fortunate nights for conception, convinced that the stars at the moment of union could dictate a child's fate. Military leaders often ordered soldiers to abstain from intimacy before battle, fearing that release would sap strength and dull courage on the battlefield. Control of desire wasn't left to chance. Entire villages functioned as watchtowers of morality, with neighbors, priests, and family members keeping careful track of who spoke to whom, who lingered too long together, and who defied communal expectations. Privacy was nearly non-existent. At the heart of this scrutiny lay a religious worldview that framed the body as a battlefield for the soul. Church doctrine insisted that physical pleasure was a lure of the devil, a dangerous distraction meant to pull humans away from prayer and salvation. Even for married couples, too much enjoyment in the marriage bed wasn't seen as passion. It was a pathway to damnation. Medieval life demanded a constant struggle between desire and discipline. To keep lust at bay, men and women turned to strict regimens, fasting until weakness dulled the body, plunging into icy water to cool the blood, or whipping themselves as acts of piety. Young people were warned to avoid foods thought to heat the humors, music that stirred the senses, or festivals that encouraged laughter and touch. Yet beneath this rigid facade, a hidden world of defiance thrived. Ordinary people carved out spaces for forbidden pleasures, slipping beyond the watchful eye of priests and neighbors. Songs sung in taverns, whispered rituals, and secret encounters revealed that repression could never fully cage human instinct. Practical realities also shaped intimacy in ways unthinkable today. With homes often no more than a single smoky room, lovemaking took place within earshot of children, relatives, and servants. Privacy was a luxury reserved for nobles, whose castles provided bedchambers, scented foods, and leisure hours for indulgence. Peasants, by contrast, experienced intimacy as necessity, hurried and functional, tied to the harsh demands of survival. Marriage itself was rarely about passion. It was an alliance of labor and lineage, forged to ensure heirs and secure land. In a world where sickness and death struck early, producing children was not just a duty, but a desperate insurance policy. Pleasure, if considered at all, was often branded as perilous, an indulgence that distracted from salvation or threatened family honor. And yet resistance lived on. Lovers found ways to meet in barns, forests, or fields, carrying with them tokens, charms, and a fierce determination to claim small moments of freedom. Desire survived, even under centuries of scrutiny, persecution, and fear. Return now to young Margot, shivering beneath the candlelight as Henrik's shadow looms. Her dread was not only of the man before her, but of the crushing weight of an entire society's expectations. Religion, family, community, and survival all pressing down on her fragile frame. The story of sexuality in the Middle Ages is not just one of prohibitions and punishments, it is also a story of resilience. Despite laws, sermons, and threats of eternal fire, men and women still sought connection, intimacy, and love. The medieval bedchamber was never private. It was public,
political, and perilous. And yet, even in the darkest corners of repression, human desire found ways to breathe. These tales remind us that intimacy lies at the very core of human life, too primal to be entirely suppressed by kings, priests, or law codes. What may seem grotesque or bewildering today was born from a dense web of faith, custom, necessity, and survival. The strangeness of medieval sexuality was not mere ignorance. It was a culture wrestling with timeless contradictions between passion and restraint, spirit and flesh, freedom and control. Looking back at these practices allows us to see both the distance we have traveled and the echoes that still linger in our own age. Power, morality, shame, and desire continue to shape the most private aspects of our lives. The medieval world shows us that sexuality has never been purely personal. It has always been political, contested, and bound up in survival. The quest for genuine intimacy, free from fear, is not a modern invention. It is an ancient longing, repeated across centuries, carried by people who sought tenderness even in a world of cruelty and superstition. And so we return to that candlelit chamber, where Henrik's heavy shadow falls across young Margot's fragile form. But we now recognize that this is not just the story of one frightened bride and her aging husband. It is the weight of an entire culture pressing down upon them. The fears of damnation, the burden of family honor, the terror of exposure, and the fragile hope for love in a place where love itself was rarely safe. In the flicker of the flame, in the trembling of her hands and the roughness of his touch, we witness not only their private moment, but the collision of a civilization's deepest anxieties and unspoken desires. A reminder that intimacy in the Middle Ages was never truly secret, never truly secure, and never entirely their own. The story of medieval intimacy reminds us of a timeless truth. Power may try to control desire, fear may try to silence love, but across centuries one thing never changed: human longing for connection. And just like those voices that refuse to be silenced, this channel exists to bring you the hidden, unspoken stories of history. If you believe these truths deserve to be told, if you want to see what else has been buried in the shadows of the past, don't let the story end here. Subscribe now, and let's uncover the next forgotten chapter together.